everyone. One of the readings you're going to do this week is Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Hemingway, his representation as the modern man, and the theory of his writing using the iceberg theory. So Hemingway is a man who is considered modern, in that he falls into the same vein as T.S. Eliot, whom you'll read later when we read poetry, as a person who is disenchanted with sentimentality, with fidelity to old institutions, and is a realist, sometimes a pessimist, somebody who understands the hardships of life, the futility of the struggle of life, and is disenchanted with social circumstances post-World War I. A lot of what Hemingway wrote was after the First World War, and he was part of a circle in Paris during the 1910s, 1920s called the Lost Generation. So they were often expatriates who were coming to Paris to get escape from the norms and society in the U.S., and they collected themselves in an artist community, and they wrote, and they drank, and they talked. And by being considered part of this lost generation, again, they are expressing their disdain, their dissatisfaction for almost the loss of innocence that occurred after this first Great World War. So Hemingway, unlike Mary Shelley, whom is very verbose, and her sentences are long, and she uses a lot of metaphors and similes and analogies, and her language is very flowery. Hemingway's is very stripped down, so he emphasizes short, straightforward sentences. Dialogue is important, and like a poet, he's looking for that just right word to convey what's happening in the story. And part of his style has been attributed to something called the iceberg theory. And if you think about an iceberg, search for a white piece of paper here. If you think about an iceberg, it's a big mass of ice. But the iceberg theory is that we only see with the human eye this portion, or 1/8 of what's happening. Most of what is making an iceberg move and shift and show itself is happening underneath the water, and we don't see that at all. So for Hemingway, it was his job to make things move without you, the reader, really noticing how it's done. So to make a crude reference, kind of like sausage making, we know what the end product looks like, but we often don't know all the steps, and we probably don't want to know the steps, or it would not be as palatable. So for Hemingway, to discreetly and expertly put together this minimalist style, but to make the story still sing and work and be relatable, is an admirable feat. Hemingway had a life in which he lived large. He drank a lot. He partied a lot. He was a philanderer. He had multiple wives. He was into bullfighting, deep-sea fishing, big game hunting. It seemed like every activity that he did was large and big, whereas the writing he did was stripped and bare. So that juxtaposition of his well-lived, almost lived too much life versus the minimalist nature of his modern style of writing, again, is something worth contemplating. So as you read Hemingway, take note of his minimalist style. Take note of the fact that you don't get a description of character, oftentimes. You don't get a large description of setting, but it's just enough so that you can start to picture what's going on. And pay close attention to the dialogue. He does also not use a lot of back and forth of he said, she said, he said, she said. You have to be able to pay attention and follow along enough to realize who's talking to whom. And in this short story, I would strongly encourage you not to Google this before you read it. What is the elephant in the story? What are they arguing about? Try to figure that out before you look it up, because I think that's part of the intrigue of a story like this. All right, enjoy.